Well, thank you everybody for coming and attending, and definitely thank you to Make in LA for inviting me to be part of this. Looking forward to talking about some of my experiences. So, first off, I want to just point out there that there are many, many suppliers and manufacturers in China, in the US, and worldwide. And so what I'm going to be talking about really is focused on my own experiences and anecdotes I've shared with my colleagues. You may find that your experiences are going to be slightly different. That's kind of why they're saying right now that China is the wild, wild west. There's lots going on, lots of variety between suppliers. But what I want to definitely focus on is, working with a contract manufacturer takes a lot of effort on both your part and theirs, and it takes a really concerted effort to focus on that relationship regardless of where your manufacturing is, whether it's in China, anywhere overseas, or even in the US. So a little bit about my background. Over the past 15 years, I've switched between working full-time, managing engineering teams, to doing consulting. And I've worked on a variety of different types of hardware products: telecom, clean tech, UAVs, wearables, managing different types of teams: electrical engineers, mechanical, firmware, QA, manufacturing. So there's quite a variety of things I've been exposed to and seen over the years. In the last 10 years or so, I've really gravitated towards the manufacturing aspect of hardware development. I find it fascinating, and there's still tons of things to learn. I've lived in San Francisco for the past 15 years. I spent a lot of time in Hong Kong and lived there for a while, and now I'm based in LA. So what I tend to focus on, though, are the startup companies, the smaller hardware engineering teams, and really helping them bridge that gap from the prototype to mass production. So one of the key things I want to stress, and this applies to any contract manufacturer, is it's a marriage. Right? You are getting engaged to a supplier, and you're going to be spending a lot of time with them. There's certain things that you have to sign up for and things that they're going to guarantee to you. But the most critical thing is you have to be compatible with each other. Right? There's a wide range of manufacturers, different services, different capabilities, different experiences. You have to find one that's the best match for you, your team, and your product. Just about every contract manufacturer does their basic services: PCB assembly, box build, testing, and usually some form of inventory and logistics. But the key is to find one that actually has relevant experience to you, to your product. One that has experience working in the market space or the type of product that you're building. You're just going to find this to be much, much more efficient and a much, much better relationship. They will have precedence in terms of how to identify any nuances if issues arise with your product. They're certainly going to have some more experience in terms of resolving issues, and hopefully they'll be able to have an experienced engineering team that will know how to resolve these issues firsthand and not requiring you to come out and solve it yourself. The other key thing that I want to focus on with regards to picking a CM is their tier. So CMs are typically categorized into tier 1, 2, and 3, really focused around the volume and the capacity at which they can manufacture. So it's very tempting to try and continue to work or to gravitate towards tier 1s, the large guys in the industry, because of just the prestige and presumably the vast amount of resources they provide. But if you guys aren't hitting those expected volumes, you're actually going to find the relationship's going to go sour really quickly. So if you're at low volume, focus on low volume manufacturing. If you're at high volume, definitely focus on high volume, tier 1s. I don't want to discourage that, but you really have to be honest in both ways. Don't overestimate or underestimate your expected volumes for the next 3 or so years. Obviously, it's hard to predict the future, but your product and your market will certainly give you reasonable guidelines of what your expected volumes will be in the first couple of years. Because if you overstate what your projected volumes are going to be, and you attract a tier 1 or tier 2, and over some time they realize you're not hitting those numbers, they're not going to give you the time of day much longer. They're going to swap out their A team for their B team. They might start making up for that lost margin with additional fees, NREs, and the relationships can go sour pretty fast. And the same thing goes true for vice versa. So if you grossly underestimate your production and you end up working with a lower capacity CM, like a tier 3, and you quickly outgrow their capacity, you're going to be stressing their team, stressing their resources, and again, that also might not work out well. So be honest with your forecasting numbers when you're talking to your CMs and evaluating them. And again, this is true worldwide. So remember, your product, presumably this is your main source of income and revenue, so your product is your lifeline to success for your company. You don't want to just hand it over to any contract manufacturer. You really need to spend the time to vet them, to understand them, to work with them, and definitely trust your gut. Your gut will tell you if this is the right partner or not. So one thing specific to China. So there's a common theory or conception that China is cheaper. And that's yes or no. I think it's really, it's short just to use as a blanket statement. You really have to look at the whole picture. All right. There's lots of hidden costs that are associated with NPI, new product introduction. There's travel time, there's shipping time, there's NREs, non-recurring engineering costs, fixtures, all these peripheral types of expenses that need to get amortized across your bill of materials, your per unit cost. And you may find that the nature of your product that you'll have a disproportionate amount of fees or expenses with all these peripheral costs that actually credited to being in China or anywhere overseas that actually might have been cheaper to work locally or somewhere in the US. So yes, labor rates are typically cheaper in China and any overseas country, but parts, materials are often actually the same price, right? Especially when you're first starting out, you're negotiating directly with your suppliers for your pricing, but they'll give you nominally the same price whether you're manufacturing in China or locally. So if your product is a very labor-intensive product and very complex, China or overseas might be the right solution. If it's a very simple product that doesn't take many steps to assemble or test, maybe US, somewhere local to where you are is a better option. So the other thing to take into account is definitely the challenges with any language or cultural barrier. China, Mexico, Vietnam, any foreign country, you're going to have language issues, you're going to have cultural differences, and those are definitely not meant to be underestimated because any kind of miscommunication can lead to very costly mistakes, delays, redos, what have you. So definitely take those things into consideration. All right, so what are the main things to ask yourself when evaluating whether to stay local or go overseas? So again, how complex is your product? Is it very straightforward? Is it very simple, just a clamshell type of solution? Very minimal amount of skills that are needed or time to assemble or test? How much experience does your team have in manufacturing, right? How well will you be able to identify when issues start to arise with your manufacturer, when things start slipping, problems start arising? How skilled and experienced is your team to be able to identify those things? And how mature and stable is your product, right? So are you still kind of in the early stages of development and it's very vulnerable to changes? Or is it stable and you don't see anything really changing between now and your mass production? Because every time you introduce change, it creates risk and it potentially delays. So maturity is definitely something to consider. All right, and then I want to talk about Chinese quality. So another common conception is that Chinese work is cheaper and poorer quality. And that's not necessarily true. Don't confuse poor quality with poor documentation. So what often happens is you didn't document your product well. And again, maybe due to language or cultural barriers, these manufacturers weren't able to pick up on those nuances and they ended up producing your products incorrectly or made mistakes, right? So I really encourage you to invest in good documentation practices. Clear documentation, clear requirements, tolerances. Basically, you want to be able to provide a stack of documentation, your bill of materials, your assembly documentation, your testing documentation, and hand it over to them and conceptually never hear from them again, and they would be able to produce and deliver your product exactly as you want. So if you look at your documentation, you don't think that's true, spend some time on it, all right? Cross those T's, dot those I's. It will go a long way, I guarantee it. So let's say you do decide you're going to China. You think it's the right solution for you. Where do you start? How do you talk to CMs? How do you evaluate them? What's the best approach? So location. Location is absolutely critical, especially if you're based in the US. The nominal travel time from here to Shenzhen is about 18-20 hours when you include flight, travel, local buses, local transportation. So you don't want to end up far away from a local transportation hub, from the airports, from any of the major train stations. So it's pretty common for a contract manufacturer to have headquarters in Hong Kong or southern Shenzhen, but their actual factory might be deep into the country, several hours drive, okay? So pay attention to where they are. And many CMs will have several locations where they manufacture, so be explicit with them. Where exactly would your product be manufactured? Which facility, okay? And then also, you're gonna be spending a lot of time there, and you're gonna be spending a lot of time in a hotel. Usually a CM provides a list of hotel options that they like to work with. Find out how far away the hotel is from the factory. Every morning, every night, you can be driving back and forth. Usually they'll have a driver to pick you up. But if it's an hour away, you know, that's 2 hours of your day you're spending just going between the hotel and the facility. So these are they're subtle details, but they go a long way because, again, time is of value. So you want to be as efficient as possible. And maybe Shenzhen's not right for you. You know, there's plenty of good, high-quality contract manufacturers in Beijing or Shanghai. There are other places in China and obviously other countries that have tons of great options. So definitely want to stress that make sure it's clear where your product is going to be manufactured and how easy is it going to be for you to get there. So your initial visit, okay, you've identified a couple of contract manufacturers, you've contacted them, you set up a couple of meetings. Hopefully you can pack in like 3 or 4 in a single trip. Plan for your visit to be nominally 4 to 6 hours. It's a good portion of the day. They like to pull out, you know, all the stops, give you the dog and pony, and you're going to be spending a lot of time on the floor walking the facility. So at the initial meeting, certainly take note of who's in attendance. You know, they will like to bring some of their high brass, you know, hopefully the CEO or some of the project managers. But definitely take note because that will also give you a sense of their level of seriousness about the project and how much they want to work with you, okay? On your side, definitely bring someone high tier as well, CEO or VP, someone who actually has authority to make a decision. Okay, same thing. If you bring just your engineers or no one who has authority, the CM might not think that you're taking it seriously either. So, business cards. It's a subtle thing, but many cultures love having business cards and also learn how to present them. There's definitely cultural differences. You know, respect their culture. The two-hand process is very common in Asian countries. You know, these subtleties, they're evaluating you, you know, like they usually have their pick of the litter of companies to work with. So they want to only work with the highest quality and mature companies. So don't take this initial meeting lightly. There's the little, you know, the social, you know, gauging each other. It happens, you know, come prepared, look professional. You know, the Silicon Valley jeans and a hoodie doesn't fly over there, right? Business casual, be professional, right? You want to put your best foot forward. All right, so often the CM will give a presentation, you know, 30, 40 minutes. They have a slide deck that they like to go through. A lot of it's, you know, normal dog and pony, fluff type of stuff. There are definitely some nuggets that you should be paying attention to. First off, what are the markets that they manufacture in, right? Again, as I said earlier, you want to make sure that they manufacture products that are in a similar market to you for those reasons I explained. Experience goes a long way. Location, I mentioned the nuances of where you'll be manufacturing. The revenue and the volumes per customer, and that will give you a sense, again, of their tier, of their capacity. Are they a right match for where your product is expected to fit in? Who owns the company? right? It's very common that the company, certainly in Shenzhen, is owned by a Hong Kong entity or Taiwanese entity, but the factory itself is in Shenzhen and they use local labor for cheaper rates. And the reason for that to pay attention to is, again, it goes to the cultural differences, right? Typically, companies that have Hong Kong management are a little more Western friendly, a little more Western savvy. Same with Taiwan, okay? What countries are their customers in, right? Are they only producing products for customers in Asia or in Europe, or are they also in the US? And again, it's really to evaluate their experiences with your culture, right? You're trying to alleviate any risk for miscommunication or misunderstandings, and the more experiences they have with customers that are close to you, both in the product and demographics, the higher chance of success. So you will also be expected to make a presentation. You can keep it light. You don't have to go into details. You don't have to disclose any IP at this point. There's nothing proprietary. You don't have to sign NDAs if you don't want to. Your fundraising pitch deck is certainly fine. It kind of gives an overview of what markets you're going to be selling in, again, to make sure it's a match. You should give a high-level summary of the BOM so they understand the complexity. They're going to start evaluating. They're usually going to have a project manager and an engineer or two in the room. And give them enough technical details so they can properly evaluate the complexity or the size or the magnitude of your product. A couple of key things of the electrical and mechanical components, maybe a couple of unique things, or say that there's nothing unique, that it's just a bunch of your standard 402 passives on a 4-layer PCB and a clamshell enclosure. Great, right? Again, the purpose of this is so that they can gauge what skills and what team they need to bring to the table in order to build your product. And then also the peripheral stuff. So not just the materials, but also the assembly time and the test time. If you have those numbers, great. Give them a sense of how long it's going to take to assemble and test, because again, that gives them the opportunity to start evaluating what kind of services they need to provide to build it. Certainly, if there's any specific skills that are necessary to build your product or tools, right? If there's something unique about it, do they need to bring on people or buy tools to be able to assemble your product? Adds a little bit of friction to the process, but a lot of CMs are more than willing to do what they need to do to be able to win your business. Any regulatory tests requirements. So if your product has to go through UL or FCC, CE, any of these existing regulatory requirements, let them know, okay? Your standard stuff, UL and FCC, almost any CM can handle, but if there's any peripheral stuff like FDA or any other type of regulatory, just let them know. So again, you can confirm that they have those resources. And then likewise, any required certification that the manufacturer needs. So if you're building an Apple accessory, you often need to find a CM that has MFI certification. They're authorized to build Apple products. Any specific ISO certifications that your product or industry requires, let them know, okay? And then the last thing that's important is to talk about your volume forecasting. Remember I said, don't make this number up, don't treat this number too lightly, be honest. And of course acknowledge that you're still starting up and these numbers have some, level of merit or uncertainty to them, but they're going to look at the number of zeros. And also, if you can give some projections over the next 2 to 3 years, they can see what that hockey stick, what that ramp looks like. Because that's going to be, again, important to make sure that it's a match, right? IP protection. So this is definitely a question I get a lot about working in China. I'm not saying it isn't a problem, but it's not as vast as I feel like people make it out to be, right? It's a small world, it's a networked world. If a CM gets a reputation for stealing your IP, they're going to go out of business really quickly. No one's going to be able to want to work with them. Not saying don't take this issue lightly, but don't be overly cautious, right? It is a catch-22. You want to find a CM who manufactures similar products to yours, again, to have that experience, which typically means competitors. But you also want a CM who knows how to protect your IP from your competitors and their other customers. So ask questions specifically. How do they protect IP, right? Do they have separate management teams to work with the different customers? Do they have different assembly lines, different locations? Do they put up barriers, physical barriers, just to block view from each line? Ask the questions. Use your gut. Are these acceptable answers? Are they answering my questions? Are they addressing the problem? Are they acknowledging the issue? Right? Don't get caught up on this. Right? Do your best. Do your due diligence. But at the end of the day, they are interested in doing good work. They know you're a Western company. They know about our culture and IP protection. They will usually be very professional about this. Okay. So you've gone through the basic introductions, your presentations, and now the absolute critical thing is to make sure you walk the floor. Okay. This is where usually you make or break the deal, understanding what their services are, what their capabilities are, their quality, the culture, okay? And this is just an overview of the general steps that you'll go through at any factory, any CM. So there's usually the incoming step where raw parts are coming in. How do they handle the incoming quality control? How do they inventory your parts? The assembly process, you'll have reflow and wave for your electrical components, you'll have testing, you'll have mechanical assembly, and then final finished good testing. And then on what we'll call like the finished good side is the final packaging, how they inventory your products, and certainly if they offer any logistics services to handle shipping to your customers. So those are the general stages, and you want to make sure you touch on all of them as you do your walkthrough. All right, so first impressions, right? This is the gut check, right? You walk onto the floor. When you have your initial meeting, it's going to be in the boardroom type of style place. There'll be a nice, beautiful mahogany desk. They'll give you water, they'll give you tea. It's very fancy. The assembly line, the floor is where the pedal hits the floor, the metal, right? This is where stuff gets done, and you can't hide the truth here. So take note of everything. What's the professional quality? What's the cleanliness? Are there security measures that go into place when you come in? How easy was it to walk into different locations? ESD protection. So ESD is not as big a concern here in California because it's not as humid, but in China and other Asian countries, it's a big issue. And so a lot of electronic components are very susceptible to ESD damage. How seriously do they take this, right? Ask a lot of questions. Whether you're experienced or not, asking a lot of questions goes a long way, both in your own edification of what they're doing, but also it gives you a better sense, when you are 20 hours away, you're going to remember, how they did something. And so your questions over email will be much more poignant, okay? Then specifically focusing on the assembly lines. So doing a proper audit of a reflow and wave electronic assembly line is a very, very big topic. And I'm only going to do a cursory review of it here. But certain things to look at. So how many lines do they have? How many assembly lines do they have? Are they all identical or are they different? How many work shifts do they have? Is it 2 shifts, 2 8-hour shifts, 3 8-hour shifts? Do they work 7 days, 5 days? And the reason for these questions is to understand their capacity. So in the case, let's say you have an emergency order, a customer comes, says, I want to buy 10,000 of your parts. I'll give you a really great check. I'm the best customer ever. You weren't planning to do a build, this next month. Can your CM support you, right? Likewise, you have, ramp up for Christmas or whatever, a higher order than normal. Can your customer support you? Can your CM support you? Ask to talk to the line managers, right? So every stage of the assembly process has a dedicated line manager. Those are the people that are actually going to be spending the most time with your product and be the most familiar with your product. Talk to them, right? And what you're looking for is, how relatable are they? Certainly what their English comprehension is. Can you talk to them easily? Or will you always have to go through the management? It's very common that the management at a CM will be fairly fluent in English and understand cultural nuances and what have you, but you don't want to always have to have your dialogue go through the management. There's just, again, the risk of some miscommunication as it goes down to the floor. So try and get a hold of line managers, try and engage a conversation with them, size them up, understand their experience. Take note of the quality of the equipment, right? Does it look clean? Does it look well maintained? How sophisticated is it? Does it look like it was from the 50s, or does it look like it was purchased recently? And that goes true of any kind of supplier, right? You want to see how progressive they are in maintaining their facilities. How automated is the process? Again, the more automation there is, the less risk of error, right? Does each stage of the assembly process require someone to manually move the parts to the next stage? Or many more progressive facilities will have a conveyor belt that goes through all the stages, right, with minimal hand touching. All right, SOPs and testing, so standard operating procedures and testing. So when you're walking the floor, you'll see at each of the stages of the assembly process, there's usually some 8.5 by 11 printed sheet that has the instructions on how to do that step, and that's called the SOP. Look at them, right? They're usually hanging over the station. What's the quality? What's the detail? There may or may not be in English, but you can get a sense, how much time are they spending on that? Because a lot of the workers, there's certainly as many shifts, you don't know how many unique people are going to be doing that step, right? They usually, for efficiency, they make each step granular enough that any of their operators can do it, right? And so it really relies on high quality procedures in order to allow that to happen. Because if there's any room for interpretation, every person, every operator is going to do it slightly differently, which creates variance, which creates risk, right? So you want to pay attention to that. Testing, very, very critical, right? Ask about their internal testing procedures. I'm going to talk a little bit later about providing your testing, but that's different. What are their own internal metrics that they capture? How do they capture it? A common report is called first pass yield, and it usually happens at each of the stages. What metrics do they record? Who sees it? How often? How do they act upon it, right? Again, this is certainly for your own understanding and to make sure it's someone who's doing things the way you want, but it also gives you a sense of their professionalism, right? How seriously do they take those things? General services. These are also more the peripheral. What other services do they offer? As I said in the beginning, every CM does PCB assembly, box build, and testing. But what about vibration testing, environmental testing, RF testing, pre-UL, pre-FCC? Usually, CMs will offer some range of these services, and these are kind of like the icing on the cake, but can make or break a deal because it means you can do everything at one shop. You don't have to send it to another supplier to do these things. It's on-site injection molding. So do they have the facilities to do injection molding on site? Not a deal breaker if they don't, but again, it's just one less supplier you have to manage. It's one neck to choke to do your whole process, to do your whole assembly. There are logistics services. Do they offer that for you, right? Especially as you're starting out, and if your product is of significant volume, warehouse space isn't cheap, certainly over here in the United States. Do they offer logistics services? Again, not a deal breaker if they don't, but it is certainly better if they can handle all your customer shipping needs. And general engineering services. This is also, it's really important. See if you can talk to their engineers. What's the quality of their engineers, the size of their staff, their experience, the different focuses. Again, you're looking to see, do they match what you need to build your product? So, all right. You guys, everyone, great trip to China. You've had as much, Chinese food as you can and absorb the culture. And you come back home and you say, okay, guys, we're going to China, right? We've talked to 4 or 5 different CMs. We know we want to go here. How do we pick the right one? So start off with do an RFQ, request for quote. All right, and this is also a very critical process. Here's where you're evaluating your different options and you're really getting into the weeds. And again, this is true for any CM, any supplier, not just China, okay? So send a BOM, and this one obviously has more detail. It doesn't have to have all your secret sauce. You can redact some of your proprietary parts or proprietary, processes. What you're trying to do is just create a normalized bill of materials, assembly instructions, and testing instructions that you send the same to every single person you want to quote on your bid. You're not going to get into the final quote because that, trust me, Once they start diving into your product, they do a DFM review, they're going to be able to better, more accurately quote the process. Now is usually just a rough wag of what the cost will be. So you can hold back some information if you want to. But the point is that you're sending a reasonably representative bill of materials, assembly, and test documentation. All right. So you get a bunch of quotes back. How do you evaluate them? All right. So certainly look at the thoroughness, right? Did they just do a very cursory, haphazard job, or did they take it seriously, right? In some cases, CMs, that's the way they say they want to do a no bid, is they just say, it'll be $10,000, right? And there's no detail, right? That's their polite way of saying we're not interested in this product without actually saying that, okay? Quality of their questions. Do they have a lot of questions they ask you after you release the RFQ package? How good are the questions? Are they relevant? Are they irrelevant? Do they show understanding of your product? Do they show experience with your products, right? And these are these are the peripheral, the social engineering, evaluating each other. Definitely pay attention to the NRE cost, the fixed costs. Those add up quickly. Do they have to build a lot of fixtures? Do they have to procure new equipment? Do they have to hire new staff? They often, depending on the relationship, may or may not pass those fees on to you. Pay attention to those because they have to be amortized across your final unit price to get an actual landed cost per unit, okay? So very common mistake for someone just getting started manufacturing. The manufacturer will say it will cost $8 to build your unit at volume 10,000 units. Oh, by the way, there's a $150,000 NRE fee, right? So those $150,000 NRE fees has to be amortized across your 10,000 units, and that's what your true landed per unit cost is, okay? It's not the initial per unit cost that they said, and they don't always show that to you. So you have to definitely pay attention to NRE costs. What's their price reduction strategy, right? A main reason why you're using a contract manufacturer is because they presumably have much better purchasing power than you. They can get better deals, they can get better pricing, they can get better lead times. So it's pretty normal, especially when they're first doing an initial quote, they'll use their cookie cutter standard pricing, but ask them, how are they going to get the pricing down, right? What's their strategy? It's through, you can expect some price reduction, not only 5% on parts just through sheer volume, but that's a passive approach. What's their aggressive approach? How are they going to drive costs down, right? Listen to their answers. Is it through DFM? Is it through better negotiation? Is it they're going to provide other suppliers to work with? What have you? Again, it's a relationship. You want them to help you as much as possible. Listen to their answer, okay? And again, the quote is another point for a gut check. Are you happy with how they responded to your RFQ? Do you feel comfortable with their professionalism, with their thoroughness? You may have been very impressed with your on-site visit, but the quote didn't really show that they understood what we were doing. Okay. And another key thing, so hopefully by now you've narrowed it down to about one or two contract manufacturers. Now you want to get into what's called the MSA, the Manufacturing Service Agreement. This is an absolutely critical document that should not be taken lightly, and it involves lawyers. This is the contract that identifies all the terms of your engagement. Who pays for what? Who's liable for what? What warranties are covered? What's not covered? How are POs placed? What are timelines you have to hit? What happens if you make a change, right? This is not to be taken lightly. Definitely dive into it. Spend some time on it. Talk to them. Talk to a lawyer, because you need to know what you're responsible for and what they're responsible for. And certainly if any actions you take, if they have any financial repercussions according to this MSA. There's a lot of details in this document, and it's worth spending time on. But the other thing I want to stress is do not place any orders with your contract manufacturer until the MSA is signed. If it's not signed, you have no protection. If something goes wrong with that order, you're not covered, right? They can just start passing fees through to you that you're going to be responsible for. So make sure the MSA is signed and it's got favorable terms for you before you place any significant order. I'll say that. Prototype's fine, but any significant volume order, make sure the MSA is signed. All right, you found your CM. You're happy, MSA is signed, the quote's good, pack your bags because you're going to China. So the initial bring up, you're going to be spending a lot of time on site. I highly recommend it. It's not something to do over email or even Skype calls for efficiency reasons. There's going to be a lot of nuanced questions from the engineers, from the line managers, from the project managers. How do you want this? How do you do that? How do you want this label? Is this right? Is this color right? Are these blemishes okay? This or that. Typically engineers will be the most valuable, but having 1 or 2 engineers on site during this stage will make the NPI, the new product introduction process, go much more smoothly and much more efficiently. So I plan to have people on site. Normally 3 to 4 weeks is pretty normal, right? It takes time. Some of it's just lead times as they're procuring tools or setting up lines, what have you. It's just inherent lead times in this industry. But a lot of it's actually time to set up the line and build it right. Okay. So one of the things that you're responsible for are quality inspection points. So a good CM will hopefully have their own internal metrics because they need to measure their own performance. You know, how good is our assembly line? How good are our workers, efficiency-wise? How many issues are they finding? That's their metrics, right? But your metrics are specific to your product, the functional testing, right? Are their products being assembled correctly? So there's 2 main inspection points. One is at the PCBA level. And so arguably PCBAs are the most complex part of your product, assuming you have electronics, because they're small parts. There's usually very many of them, and it's a complex system. So you need to have functional tests specifically for the PCBAs as they come off the assembly line before they go into any kind of mechanical enclosure. These are typically what's called like your bed of nails fixtures. You put your PCBA in, close the lid, a bunch of pogo pins, make contact with the board, and you have some type of test that runs through and makes sure that everything's assembled properly. That is very, very critical because if that's not done properly, sometimes these kind of dormant issues will come up. Best case, you find it before it actually gets shipped. Worst case, customer finds it, right? So you want to spend definitely a lot of time on this step of functional test. And then last is the finished good. So once it's all assembled, you usually have some type of quick functional test. Does the system work properly once it's finally assembled? Okay? And these are 2 things that you're responsible for. But the CM is the one who's going to be actually implementing it, right? It's not going to be your team. So make sure it's polished, it's robust, it doesn't need you, it's well documented, so you can empower the CM to operate it, to maintain it, to maybe build a duplicate. If your volumes are going up and they want to run stations in parallel, give them, there's nothing to hide here, there's usually nothing proprietary here, certainly in the mechanical components of it. Give them the BOM, give them the schematic, let them build more. They can probably build them cheaper too. The results. So what happens to all these test results? So establish guidelines over where it's kept, how you access it, how often. Not every factory has internet access on the floor, right? So sometimes someone has to manually upload this information to some file server somewhere. Set those guidelines, right? How do you do reports on this? How do you give them feedback? Things are going well, going not. Remember, your goal is to empower your CM to give them confidence that they've built your product properly, right? They know if a part, isn't assembled properly, but they don't know if it's functioning properly, right? Especially if there's, certain temperature range it's supposed to work over, or certain voltages or different, scenarios. If you don't tell them that, you don't empower them that, they're not going to know. They're not as immensely familiar with your product as you are, right? They can look at it and they can say, nothing's fallen off, but it doesn't mean it's not a brick, right? It doesn't work properly. So you need to give them the confidence that they've assembled it properly and they feel proud of their work and they can warranty their work, going back to the MSA stuff. Okay. So the first build. So whatever your initial mass production build is, it's customer facing, don't accept it until you inspect it, okay? And this, definitely for the first time, I recommend being on site. Let the CM say, we're done, we've built your product, right? It's in its packaging, it's on a pallet, it's ready to go. That's when they say, okay, we're good. They've delivered the product. That's when you go in and you say, okay, let's see. Open up a product, take it out of the box. Was the packaging right? Was the instructions included? Was it the packaging material correct? Was it upside down? What's called the out-of-the-box experience when a customer opens their product. Apple is notoriously good at this, right? All the way then, keep drilling down, drill down. Is it functional? Open it up, right? Are there scrapes? Are the stickers upside down or backwards or scratched or the wrong color or this or that? Pay attention to this stuff, okay? I recommend investigating hiring what's called a source inspector because again, unless you're a large company, you probably don't have the resources to have someone at the factory every time you do a production build. You can hire a third party, which is called a source inspector, to do it for you. And they will schedule the time with you and the manufacturer when a order is ready, and they will do this process. And another thing I encourage you to look into is what's called AQL, acceptable quality limits. And that's how you tell the source inspector and your contract manufacturer what is acceptable in terms of quality levels, right? Just pure Gaussian normal distribution, some parts will have blemishes. Some parts might have some less than ideal performances. The AQL says, what is our level of acceptance on that, right? And it really depends on the type of product you're building and the type of market you're in, right? You're building an iPhone, very high quality consumer electronics, no scratches, no scuffs, no mismatched colors, on the enclosure. You're building some industrial part that's installed in the plenum above the ceiling. No one actually ever sees it. Who cares, if there's a little scuff or not? It's really not part of the product. The customer's not going to see it. So you don't have to set the same level of quality for every type of product. But these are definitely things that I highly recommend investigating. All right, getting to the end here. So what are the key takeaways? And again, I want to stress that while, yes, this presentation was focused on China, at least certainly the topic, a lot of these things pertain to any contract manufacturer anywhere in the world, okay? Basic processes are the same wherever you go, all right? Yes, using foreign suppliers can give you cheaper labor costs, but it does also increase the risk, again, because of language and cultural barriers, and potentially adds delays because of these risks, right? It takes more time for you to prepare your documentation. It takes more calls to make sure things are going correctly. And that's if nothing goes wrong. But if something does go wrong, obviously whatever time or costs are incurred to redo it, right? Again, because of language, cultural barriers. Not to say that someone local to you can't make mistakes, but you've just increased the risk when you use overseas suppliers. And the reasonable strategy, and there's nothing wrong with this, is especially if you're a young company just starting out and don't have an experienced manufacturing team, start locally, right? Get the process down. Get your manufacturing procedures down. Get a good, 1 or 2 successful production runs under your belt. You'll flush out your process. It'll flush out your documentation. It'll certainly educate you really, really quickly. And then some local CMs even have an overseas facility exactly for this, where you'll start local and then they will transfer it themselves to their lower labor rate facilities overseas. And the good CMs will even use the same exact equipment, so they literally just transfer the files and everything's the same. Other CMs might have different facilities over there, but at least it's the same company and they have experience of transferring it. Or you may have to transfer it yourself, which has a little bit of overhead to it. But again, as a young company, your main goal when you first start out is getting your product to market fast and correct. You need to make a really good impression with your customers quickly, right? You don't want to get bogged down with all this overhead of working with a foreign company, the delays and the risks. You're not really expected, in my opinion, to be profitable when you first start out, right? You're expected to get out there quickly and get customers to engage with your product quickly. And often using local suppliers helps that, supports that. Not always, right? There's always risk with anything, but just something to think about. There's nothing wrong with starting locally and then transferring it somewhere else if that's a better model. But at the end of the day, you have to decide, your company has to decide what is the best strategy for you, right? So what I find is a useful tool is reduce all the elements to dollars, because you can very easily compare dollars to dollars. You know, what is certainly the price? That's the easiest of working for your, you know, what's the bill of materials, the quote, and the NREs, but time. So put some value on time. You know, what do you pay your staff, right? How many extra hours will it take to work with one supplier versus another? What is the incurred cost for that? The added delays. You know, again, even if there's no mistake, you can pretty reasonably expect to be a longer period to get to mass production with an overseas facility. Even just the travel time, right, induces delays. What's the loss of potential revenue for those delays? If you ship in March instead of December, 3 months, what was the potential loss of revenue, right? Put those to dollars. I find that's the best way to compare apples to apples. Thank you. So feel free to email me for any questions or follow-ups. I'm happy also to distribute the slides, but I'm definitely open to taking questions now. Yes?
What are some of the horror stories that you have from?
How many hours you got? The question was, what are my horror stories? So, and again, I don't want to generalize too much. I don't want to get in trouble because, again, it's my own experiences, and I'm not going to say this is ubiquitous. I do find, from my own personal experiences, that several Chinese suppliers, culturally, they don't ask questions as readily as U.S. suppliers, right? A U.S. supplier, they get some document and something doesn't look right, pretty quickly you'll get a call, like, is this what you meant, or what have you? And I've had some firsthand experiences in China, question never comes, right? And it doesn't get caught till it's too late. Yeah, I can, offline after, I can share many experiences. But typically, what the root of the issues are is they don't ask questions. So you need to prepare for that when you train them or prepare your documentation. I've spent hours and hours even knowing that, preparing documentation, crossing every T, dotting every I, thinking there's no way they can screw this up. They screw it up, right? They'll find some way. So, yes?
There was one, when you were talking about testing,
Yes.
You know, in-house testing and all that. What's the kind of cutoff for a person testing? They're testing their own team as opposed to just taking that, product and taking it somewhere else and having someone else test.
You mean as a finished good?
As a finished good,
Yeah.
you were talking about, you're like, it's easier to have them test in-house.
Yeah.
So you don't have to take it somewhere else.
Yes.
But do you ever have it
Oh, like,
not, fudge the numbers because basically testing your own people?
yeah, so the question was, how do you decide, where to focus your testing resources, whether leveraging the CM or using outside services? Well, again, boil it down to costs, right? So when the product is being assembled, and it's open, and you're doing, intermittent test steps before the final assembly, it's much, much more efficient to test it there while the sucker's cut open versus letting them go all the way through to final assembly and then opening it back up, right? It is, there's these horror stories about, them fudging the numbers or pretending to test and they don't test because they want to save dollars. There are ways to detect that and prevent that when you build a test fixture. You can hide secret codes in the product that only get printed if the unit actually was tested. So if you have some mistrust issues with your supplier, there are ways around that. But at the end of the day, again, you have to err on the side of trust, right? It's a relationship, it's a marriage, it really is. And so you want to start with the concept that they are working for you in your best interest, and they are doing the best they can. So empower them with testing capabilities because not only is it more efficient, right, versus using an outside a third party, but it also educates them, right? So that certainly as they start to see mistakes or failures, a good team will root cause it and say, well, why? Why are we getting these mistakes, right? And they'll trace it hopefully back to something in the assembly process or in your design. They'll give you feedback. They'll say, hey, if you move these parts, you know, our machines will be able to assemble them more reliably, this or that, right? And so it's the only way to really improve the process, to improve the yield and get your costs down, is to empower them to test.
There's a question online. What is the typical volume they consider attractive?
10. So the question was, what's the typical volume? So I don't think there's a hard answer. Again, it goes down to what your costs are going to be, right? So if you're only manufacturing 10, you know, it's a very, very complex product, a very, very niche market, and your full production run is only 10 units. Look at the peripheral costs. You know, what would it take to go to a factory that's overseas or elsewhere, or further away, or less experienced? You know, a lot of CMs, it's a business, right? They're investing in you just as well. So if you have an interesting product, some of them will say, you know what, we'll waive our normal MOQs, minimum order quantities, and we want to work with you, right? And so I wouldn't say there's a minimum volume to attract CMs, but again, you want to be honest with that, and so that you can attract the right CMs. Yes, that question.
Have you ever done business in a karaoke bar in China?
Yes.
How was that experience?
It was good. That's also an offline comment. Sorry, the question was, have I ever done business in a karaoke bar? Yes, I've done business.
What did you sing?
What did I sing? I was able to avoid having to sing. But I did do business right before Chinese New Year, and they get very festive right before Chinese New Year, and there's a lot of alcohol involved. That's another story. But that too, those stories are true that you hear. You know, it's reasonably common with Asian cultures. They size you up outside the office to know if they want to do business with you. So those social engagements, you know, don't take them lightly. You know, if you're polite and professional and say, you know, I gotta go back to the hotel, or because of time difference, you know, you have to communicate back with your team in the U.S., and you decline an invitation to go out, it's fine, right? It's not mandatory. But, you know, again, it's an opportunity to engage with them, to get to know them at a personal level. You know, if things go right for your company, you're going to be working with them for many years to come. So you want to make sure you want to, you know, engage with them. So, any other questions?
Anybody else online? Yep, there's another one. What is a reasonable percentage savings that can be expected in going offshore versus local?
Excellent question. So the question was, what's a reasonable amount of savings can be expected going offshore versus local? Again, that goes really back to the complexity of your product. Where you save the most money is in labor, whether during assembly or test. And so if you have a complex product that has a lot of steps, requires a lot of manual involvement, going overseas, you're going to see the greatest reduction in costs. If you have, let's see, if you have a very simple product, you know, either here or there, it can probably both work out. Where you also start to save is as you produce more and more volumes, your peripheral costs like shipping will go down as you work in Shenzhen. And mostly it's because a lot of the suppliers are local to Shenzhen. So as your contract manufacturer receive components from your electrical suppliers, your mechanical suppliers, usually those peripheral costs of shipping those will go down. There's a lot of infrastructure in a very dense area in Shenzhen that helps keeps those costs down. Whereas if you're manufacturing in the United States, maybe you're buying parts all local to your CM, but maybe you're not. And so you're shipping parts across the continent, and those will start to add up, even if the parts themselves are the same cost. So, cool. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate this opportunity. Hopefully I encouraged you to work with CMs, either locally or U.S., but or overseas. But it's not something to take lightly. There's a lot of work that you're responsible for. It's not something you can just pick a CM and send over the wall and expect your products to come back error-free. So, great. Thank you.
Thank you.